As Cardinal Mill's coffin reached the altar, a Swiss guard suddenly stepped forward and shouted, "This man doesn't deserve your reverence. He deserves justice." Gasps froze the air in St. Peter's Basilica. No one had ever dared defy the church like this. Cameras rolled. The Vatican trembled. What happened next will leave you speechless. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The incense still hung thick in the air, curling like ancient spirits around the vaulted ceiling of St. Peter's, where shadow and candlelight danced in uneasy alliance. The crowd had held its breath as the funeral bells tolled, each chime a thunderous echo of ritual power, echoing through the nave like a judgment. Cloaked in the heavy gravity of the rite, cardinals flanked the center aisle, crimson robes folded like petals of authority. The congregation had come not just to mourn, but to reassert the grandeur of the church, to reaffirm, through spectacle, that power cloaked in sanctity remained untouchable. Yet amid this theatrical sanctity stood Sergeant Michael Rayner, rigid, contained, but not at peace. His gaze tracked the coffin as it drifted closer on the shoulders of clerics, gold leaf glinting on its carved surface, each ornate flourish seeming to deny the weight of its occupant's secrets. Rayner's jaw clenched. His pulse beat against his collar, and with every step the pallbearers took, he felt the gap between truth and ceremony widen like a chasm beneath his boots. He wasn't supposed to be there, not in this position, not on this detail. It had taken quiet maneuvering and deliberate misrepresentation to secure his place in the honor guard. He knew protocol like scripture, knew how tightly it bound every gesture, every blink, every breath. And now he was about to break it. Not in a whisper, not in secret, but in front of the entire Catholic world. The moment broke like glass. He stepped forward, not fast, not slow, but with a clarity that froze the scene. Guards turned subtly toward him, brows furrowed beneath helms. The crowd collectively inhaled. His voice cracked the liturgical silence like lightning ripping through a stained glass window. "This man doesn't deserve your reverence. He deserves justice." For one suspended instant, time fractured. The words floated, foreign, sacrilegious, irresistible. A sharp intake of breath swept across the basilica like wind through dry grass. A Monsignor dropped his rosary. The officiating cardinal turned pale beneath his vestments. Even the organist's hands hovered over the keys, frozen in disbelief. And Rayner stood his ground, eyes fixed not on the living, but on the casket, as if daring the dead to deny him. What followed was not chaos, but paralysis. The Vatican had no script for this. The guards who surrounded him hesitated not because they didn't know what to do, but because they couldn't believe it had happened. The unspoken spell of centuries had shattered with a single sentence, and the echoes of it had only just begun to ring. The Vatican's interior corridors had a silence that wasn't empty. It pressed inward, dense with centuries of secrets. After the ceremony collapsed into murmurs and protocol reasserted its grip, Sergeant Michael Rayner was escorted away, his wrists bound not with iron, but with the cold weight of institutional disbelief. There was no shouting, no spectacle, just an efficient disappearance into stone halls few ever entered. The Swiss Guard had trained for intrusions, terror threats, even coups. But this? A moral rupture performed in broad daylight by one of their own? That wasn't in the manual. By nightfall, the outside world buzzed with the kind of hunger only a scandal cloaked in ritual could feed. The story snapped through channels and forums at unnatural speed. American Swiss Guard disrupts funeral of Vatican Cardinal. The combination of Rayner's nationality, his military past, and the sanctity of the event he violated ignited a frenzy. Pundits speculated, commentators theorized, and the church's tight-lipped silence only deepened the collective itch for truth. The deeper they dug, the more curious the picture became. Michael Rayner wasn't just a guard. He had enlisted after 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned citations for valor, and then, abruptly, left military service to pursue seminary studies. Fluent in Latin, Arabic, and canon law, he had, according to internal Vatican memos, shown a disturbing level of idealism. What raised eyebrows most, however, was the document that confirmed he'd been accepted into the Swiss Guard not by standard commission, but by personal sponsorship, that of Cardinal Anthony Mills. Now seated in a reinforced chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace, Rayner faced his accusers with unnerving composure. Behind the table, Monsignor George Ellison leaned forward, a man who wore his silk cassock like armor. To his right sat Commander Bruni of the Vatican Gendarmerie, whose every glance threatened a charge of sedition. Yet Rayner didn't flinch. "I'm not here to destroy the church," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to stop it from destroying itself. Check the records in Sweden. Östersund, the orphanage Cardinal Mills financed from 1994 to 1999. The room tightened, but neither man responded. Meanwhile, tucked away in the Archivum Secretum, Marie Toland sifted through dusty reports and digitized ledgers that bore the marks of careful, almost reverent obfuscation. What she saw wasn't clerical error, it was orchestration. Grants routed through Latin-named charities, inspection reports buried under privilege seals, years missing from financial disclosures. Her breath caught. She understood the weight of what she was seeing, not just in dollars or doctrine, but in the stain it threatened to leave on faith itself. The Östersund orphanage, tucked into the Swedish countryside and long left to decay behind padlocked gates and overgrown hedges, had once been described in Vatican bulletins as a beacon of Christian mercy in a secular land. To Marie Toland, it was a name barely mentioned in passing footnotes until the pattern behind the silence began to take shape. What she uncovered in the Vatican archives wasn't simply financial irregularity. It was a latticework of engineered obfuscation, offshore entities masquerading as faith-based aid groups, falsified ledgers showing fabricated construction projects, and repeated references to healing initiatives that never matched with registered staff or facility rosters. Each document, each inconsistency, cut deeper. Among the digitized inspection records was a single line that stopped her. All interviews with residents to be conducted without recorders, per spiritual confidentiality guidelines. Cross-referenced with settlement logs sealed under papal privilege, she unearthed confidential testimonies, survivors who, as children, had been flown to religious conferences, subjected to rituals framed as deliverance, then returned with no follow-up, no medical documentation, no formal acknowledgement. Their voices had been transcribed, redacted, buried beneath layers of ecclesiastical immunity. And at the center of it all was Cardinal Anthony Mills. He had been the darling of Catholic intellectuals, the poster figure for transparency and reform. Charismatic, erudite, endlessly quotable, he'd spoken of modernizing compassion, of leading the church into moral clarity. But Marie now saw how his charm had been weaponized, how his reformist reputation became a smokescreen for monstrous transgressions. His letters to bishops were laced with euphemisms, pastoral reassignment, discreet reparations, acts of necessary reconciliation. Each phrase now read like a confession penned in code, and he hadn't acted alone. There were signatures of other clerics, some still active in the Curia, approving budgets, transferring staff, even writing liturgical reflections that veiled apologies in poetic theology. Marie compiled everything, dates, account numbers, survivor testimony, into a classified dossier. It reached Commander Bruni, then Pope Clement. The Pope read it in silence. His knuckles whitened on the armrest of his chair. For minutes, he said nothing. Then, from somewhere, perhaps inside the Vatican or in an attempt at justice, someone released the report. What followed was a tidal rupture. Global networks blasted the story. candlelit vigils turned to demonstrations. Protesters carried placards not of saints, but of victims. And this time, no saintly image of Cardinal Mills could obscure the rot. For the first time since the sexual abuse scandals of decades past, the Vatican's armor didn't just crack, it bled. The Vatican had not faced cameras like this in decades. Not willingly, not without force. Rows of reporters, flanked by boom mics and the lenses of 100 nations, lined the Sala Regia, where once monarchs had waited to kiss the papal ring. Now the air was thick with unspoken accusation, and every second of silence seemed to drag the weight of 2 millennia behind it. Pope Clement entered not in his usual serene procession, but as a man bearing the unbearable. His white cassock, though immaculate, clung to a figure that had visibly aged in a matter of weeks. His hands trembled, not from frailty alone, but from the knowledge that he stood atop a collapsing myth. The prepared statement trembled slightly in his grip as he looked first not at the cameras, but at the floor. Then he spoke, voice steady despite the hollow in his eyes. "There are truths," he began, "so grave and painful that the soul recoils from naming them. But silence, in such times, is not mercy. It is complicity." The room didn't move. Even the shutters of the cameras seemed to pause. He continued, carefully, almost like a man reading his own confession aloud. The church, he admitted, had failed, not simply through the actions of a man, but through the inertia of an entire structure. He condemned the protection of sacred image over sacred lives. He made no mention of Rayner, yet his words formed an answer to that lone voice in the basilica. Then came the unthinkable. "In recognition of these truths, the body of Cardinal Anthony Mills shall be exhumed. He shall not lie in St. Peter's crypt. He will be reburied privately, without liturgical rite." Shock radiated through the room. Never before had the Vatican disinterred a cardinal as a form of condemnation. In that moment, theology bent before morality. Centuries of unbroken decorum shattered under the weight of one choice. Rayner, meanwhile, was released with bureaucratic precision, no medal, no public thanks, no acknowledgement beyond the sealed stamp on his file. He disappeared from Vatican custody the same way he had arrived, anonymous in form, extraordinary in impact. Yet the world noticed. As he exited the city-state's gates, his posture upright but expression unreadable, cameras swarmed. He paused briefly, then delivered his final act, not with defiance, but with clarity. "A funeral is for the dead," he said, "but sometimes it's where the truth comes to life." It wasn't just a line, it was a reckoning. And in that reckoning, the Vatican, once the author of absolute narrative, was forced to listen, perhaps for the first time, to the story it could no longer write.